Welcome, everyone. This is our third edition of the CRDCN-CJE webinar series. I'd like to welcome Zhiki Chen, the new managing editor for the journal, is taking over for Kate. Just to the audience that's here, we'll say thank you to Kate for her help over the first two, and we look forward to working with Zhiki on continuing this series in the future. And we thank the Canadian Journal of Economics for the continued partnership. We have two speakers for today, as usual. First up is going to be Dalibor Stevanovic, as chair in macroeconomics and forecasting at UQAM. His interests include machine learning, finance, structural analysis, and as one might hope for someone holding his chair, macroeconomics and forecasting. Today he's going to present a paper titled A Large Canadian Database for Macroeconomic Analysis. Following him, we will have Louis-Pierre Lepage, a recent PhD from the University of Michigan, currently assistant professor at SOFI at Stockholm, and a postdoc at Queen's University, where he holds a SSHRC-funded postdoc. And he's going to present Do Age of Consent Laws Decrease Teen Births, which we were chatting a little bit about before we opened the session, is one of his earlier papers in grad school, so it's a blast from the past for him. So I'll turn it over to Dalibor for his presentation on the macroeconomic analysis database.
Okay, thank you. So let me share the screen. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity, and also the opportunity to to review my paper that I did a few years ago. So I completely forgot, well, almost forgot what exactly we did in this paper. Oh, sorry, what did I do now? Okay, good. That's what happens when you. Okay, so as you see, I don't have the slides, so I'm just gonna share some features directly from the nearly published version of the paper. Well, it's almost the published one, and then I will show you where the data are, how can you get it, what are the features of the data, etc. Okay, so that's the plan for today. So this is so what we did. In fact, when I was PhD student, I built a similar kind of data set, and back then it wasn't very easy to get a large data set of macroeconomic variables for Canada, because StatCan wasn't so great, in providing large number of time series for a very long period of time. So the problem is that they changed the methodology over time, and then when they do it, they do not go back as far as possible. So you have, I don't know, if you look for the industrial production, you have the data until 2000 something, and then you have a new data starting a little bit earlier, but not so far. So you end up with mixtures of similar data. So that was the reason to provide like a standardized large data set, and that was also similar to the one that is provided in US. So probably the most used large macroeconomic data set in the world is the one provided by Macroeconomic at the Federal Reserve of St. Louis data website, which is called FredMD. That was essentially Stock and Watson data set back in beginning of 2000. So anyway, so the idea was to provide something similar, because I mean people are trying, to do large data analysis for Canada, but they didn't have this kind of data set. So that was the idea. And then we wrote the paper, and then the paper came out finally after a few years of back and forth at the Canadian Journal of Economics. So the idea was to provide a large-scale Canadian macroeconomic database, and what the paper is doing is that after constructing those data, we try to show why these now why this data set is interesting. So how can you use it? So it contains hundreds of Canadian provincial economic indicators. We have it in 2 frequencies, so in monthly and quarterly. It is designed to be updated. I mean, it is updated regularly, and you also have real-time vintages. I mean, the real-time vintages, they are starting somewhere in 2019 when we started doing it. So eventually we will end up, maybe 20 years, we will end up having a lot of real-time vintages. So if you want to do real-time analysis, that will be useful. So the main point is that it's completely user-free, okay? And we will see how, but you don't need to deal with the data changes and methodological revisions. So we did it. Now, if you don't like the way we did it, well, then you can do it by yourself. We also provide raw data as well as transformed data to induce stationarity. And we also provide balanced panel. So what happens is that, I mean, if you collect so many variables, there are some that do not start at the beginning of the sample. There are some that they don't have last values available as most of the variables, or there are some variables that might have holes during the sample. So we replace all those missing values. So by the end of the day, you can just download a balanced panel. Okay, so the 4 useful features in this paper. So we showed, well, the first one is that there is a factor structure in the data, and this was partly by construction, in sense that the choice of the time series is highly related to a US data set of Macroeconomic or Stocker-Watson that has been used a lot for factor analysis. So the idea is to provide, data that is representative of the Canadian economy, and so you have to cover many markets. So there are data on the labor market, on production, on consumption, on prices, interest rates, monetary aggregates, international trade, and so on. Okay, so and if all this is well balanced, well, you should find a kind of de facto structure in the data, and this is the first. So this is the first remark. So that means that you can use this data set as in a factor modeling that can be applied to forecasting or to structural analysis. Okay. Then we also showed that you can use this data to forecast turning points of the Canadian business cycle. So you can, it's useful to predict the probabilities of the next recession. Okay. And then third, you can use it for forecasting key macroeconomic indicators. Since this is a large data set, well, then you can apply, any machine learning method to this data set. So it can be a simple factor analysis, regularized regression such as lasso or elastic net, but you can also use a neural network, deep learning, random forest, as you wish. And finally, you can also do structural analysis, empirical structural analysis. So the richness of the panel allow you to check, for example, the effects of the monetary policy across regions and sectors. Okay, and so that's what we showed in the paper. Okay, so these are like the 4 features that we highlight. Now, in terms of the data, so as I said, that there are 8 different groups of variables, and you can think that this is representative, of the Canadian economy. So there are So there are production variables, labor, housing, manufacturer, inventories and orders, money and credit, international trade and financial flows, prices and stock market. Okay, so for each of those category, there will be dozens of variables. Whenever is available, we will also include regional data. Now, regional data, I mean, there are not so many time series, you know. So the employment data, for example, those are easy to get for regions, for sectors. We also have that for the for housing, for prices as well. But when you turn to the production, well, then it's not so easy to get those disaggregate regional data. Okay. And then we had, as I said, we had several problems in building this data set. For example, some tables have been discontinued, and then the new tables do not go sufficiently back in time. So then we need to collect those variables. Okay, so if I give you an example here. So for example, for the gross domestic product in Canada, so these are months. So this is the monthly indicator. So let me just do this. So you see, you have a one vintage, you know, that starts in 80s, 81, but then it ends at 2012, and then you have another one starting in 1907, which is the actual one. Okay, so what we do is that we collect those two time series. So here we have to think a little bit more about it, because you know there is an overlapping period when you connect. Then the same story for housing starts and also for exports. Okay, so there are a bunch of variables where we need to do this. Then also some variables are not seasonally adjusted. Let me see. So I don't have the plot, but there are variables that are not seasonally adjusted. I think I have it here. Let me just show you. No, it's not there either. Anyway, some variables for, I think that's the unemployment duration. It is, I don't know why, but it haven't been seasonally adjusted by StatCan. And then when you do a test, a Kruskal-Wallis test on seasonality, well, then you see that there are strong seasonalities in the data. So we also remove that part. Okay. Then when I say that there is the factor structure is likely to be in this data set, you can check this by looking at the eigenvalues and or doing testing, and then you see that depending on the test, I mean, pinning down the number of factors in a large data set is a hard problem. So there are many type of procedures to do that. So you can use this Bai-Yang 2002 paper, which will give you the number of stacked factors, and then you can see there are like 6 or 5 of them. You can also look for the number of dynamic factors, in which case you will have between 1, 2, 4, 6. But the idea is that you can reduce. What's important to see here is that you can take those 200 or 300 or 400 variables depending on the data set, and you can explain more than 50% of average variation in all those time series by using only 6 or 7 factors. Okay, so that's the idea of the factor structure and the dimension reduction. Okay. Now you can check those factors. How do they look like ex post? So the problem with the factors, of course, they are not identified. Okay, so the only thing you identify is a rotation of those factors. But nevertheless, after the estimation, you can check how those factors are correlated with the observable variables. Well, then you see that the first one is related to the GDP. The second one to the GDP from finance and insurance, the third one to government bonds, the fourth one to exchange rates, and so on, unemployment, etc. Okay, so there seem to be some, you know, some sectors that are more important than the others in this data set. Okay, then we try to predict recessions. We do it in a standard way. So we take we rely on CD Howe committee dating. So R is equal to 1 if there is a recession, 0 if not, historically, and then we use a probit model. So the base model is the one that contains only the term spread, which is the standard, or the Estrela-Mishkin model of predicting recession. Then instead of using this term spread, well, we use the factors from our large data set in a probit, or we use a lasso logit model. So in this case, you do not transform the data set into a small number of factors, but you take all the variables, all the observable variables, and then you let lasso, you know, decide which of those variables get non-zero weight. Okay. And what you see is that, so this is the historical performance. So these are the recessions. So the gray areas here, these are CD Howe identified recessions from 81. And these are different models. And then if you read the paper, well, you will see that considering factors, or I mean, either through the dimensional reduction or through lasso, we find that those data are helping above the term spread to predict recessions from 1 to 18 months ahead. Okay, so that means that it is useful to consider the data if you want to you know, predict the next recession. And then you can also see which variables are important. So without surprise, if you want to predict recession 1 month ahead, so I mean, this is not predicting, this is nowcasting a recession, well then I mean, the variables that explain, you know, the cycle will be the most important. Well, but then this is a 12-month and 18-month ahead horizon. Well, then you see those term spreads coming in, but also the credit market, the housing prices, oil prices, etc. So you can get a more granular view of the importance of the variables to predicting the next recession. Then we also did a forecasting exercise in which we compare different models. So the basic model is the autoregressive one. Then we have the factor model from Stock and Watson. So this is the fusion indices, in which case we transform the big data set into a small number of factors. Then we have a bunch of penalized regressions. So there will be ridge, lasso, and elastic net that will use all the data in this large data set. Random forest, and regularized data rich model averaging. So all these methods will use this large data set, and then the idea is to compare the forecasting performance of those methods with respect to the standard, to the benchmark model, and it helps. Okay, so I'm not gonna check all the tables, but what we have tried to forecast is the industrial production, employment, unemployment rate, and CPI inflation, core CPI inflation, business credit, consumption credit, total credit, building permits, housing starts, and in almost all those cases, considering this large data set helps. Okay, so that's the main message. And as I said, you can check, you can verify how the monetary policy effect can be different across regions, sectors, and time. I let you look at it by yourself. So what I wanted to show you, so where the data are. So you can find them on my webpage. So there is a part of the website which is called CAN-MDQD. So as I say here, so this is really a public service, for academic, educational, and professional communities. I like that it has been published in the Canadian Journal of Economics, but it's essentially, a public service. So please use it. Okay, I know it's quite used. I can check. I have kind of a visitor map, so there are a lot of people using it from Canada, from United States, from Europe, even elsewhere. There are like thousands of clicks on this web page. The data has been downloaded thousands of times. I know many people that are using it, the industry. My students are using it. That's the idea. So that's why we do it. Okay. And data are here. So these are real-time vintages. So for the monthly one, we started in March 2019. And then in November 2019, we added the quarterly version. So the quarterly version is bigger because now you have all the national accounts. Okay. So all the monthly data are also in the quarterly one, but the quarterly one is augmented by the national accounts essentially. And then how it works, you just click, and then then this is downloaded, and then you have a README file. You have the list of all the variables. So these are the raw data. So these are the data that are just transformed to be stationary, and this is the balanced panel. So you really can do whatever you want with this data set after it. Now this has been used. This has been used in another paper with Kevin Morin and Adam Touré. So we did it to measure, to provide a measure of macroeconomic uncertainty. Well, we did it, just before pandemic, and then we updated during pandemic. So we published it in the special issue on COVID. But the point here is that using this data set, we can apply a method by Gerardo Ludvigsson-Eng, AER paper in 2015, to measure a general macroeconomic uncertainty in Canada. Okay, so these are those measures. So this was, as I said, this was done, during the pandemic. So there is a large uncertainty shock during pandemic. But then this measure is available here at the chair in macro and forecasting webpage. So if you go here, well, you will see all those measures there. So this is uncertainty in Canada. So this is uncertainty in Canada, but for the labor market, for production, for a housing market, and for prices. Okay, so since you have a so big data set, well, you can condition those uncertainty measures across sectors and also across regions. So you have one for Quebec, for Ontario, BC, Alberta, etc. Okay, if you are interested, on my webpage, you also have UK, so similar data set, but for UK, that we did in another paper. So essentially now you have 3 similar data sets for this kind of macroeconomic analysis, one from US, from Macroeconomic, and you have one for Canada and one for UK. Okay. So yeah, and this is really, we use it a lot. We use it to forecast inflation at the chair. So these are forecasts made by by different machine learning methods, econometric methods, and so on. We use it as well to forecast the GDP, etc. So I probably stop here. So the final point is, use it. If you have questions, let me know. The data set evolves over time. It can happen, the stat can stop producing some data. It can happen there are some copyright problems. So it's not, you might you might see some changes in the data set. We might add a yearly one or mixed frequency one. I don't know. We'll see. But if you use it, that will be great. And if you have questions about it, just let me know.
Okay, thank you, Dalibor. Does anyone have any questions? We've got the Q&A box. As I said in the chat, it defaults to the bottom of Zoom. I just might ask a few questions about the deposit, because I found it in Borealis while you were speaking. And if anyone doesn't know, the Borealis is like the new Canadian Scholars Portal Dataverse. Is it being updated there in addition to your website? Like, where can we go? Is it always your website to get the most recent version, or is Borealis?
No, so there's, Marie Connolly forced us to put this on Dataverse.
Good.
But that was the only time we did it. And
oh, okay.
I honestly have no idea how this is. I didn't use it. One of my students did it. So I will say that if you want to get those data, you go on my webpage, at least for now. Now, if we figure out how to, if we need to figure out how to do it, in different way, well, we will do it. But
yeah, I will say, for anybody who doesn't know you personally or know this paper, if someone's looking for macroeconomic data for Canada and they go to Borealis, they'll find this, right? So
okay,
as far as data discovery goes, that's probably not a bad idea to keep updating it there. That is going to be the sort of brand new and shiny sort of
okay, good. That's great.
Okay. Any questions? This is, like as Dalibor noted, this is obviously a huge active service. This was, self-evidently a lot of work. So I think we all owe him some gratitude for having produced this for us, for all our use as we need it. Okay, well, if anything comes up during Louis-Pierre's talk, we'll probably have more time at the end for some Q&A, but I will turn it over to Louis-Pierre for his paper.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for inviting me to present my work today called Can Age of Consent Laws Decrease Teen Births? This was actually my second year PhD labor field paper, so it was good to kind of look back after all these years, and I do think I remember most of it, hopefully. The motivation for the paper is actually pretty simple. Teen pregnancy, motherhood, and the protection of youth more generally are regarded as important social issues that motivate a lot of policy attention in both the US and Canada. One fact that is well known in the literature is that rates of teen pregnancy have steadily been falling over the past decades. So it might seem like it's an issue of decreasing importance, but one issue that is often much less frequently discussed is the issue of particularly young teen mothers having children from much older adult partners. In the US, it's been found that a disproportionate fraction of the youngest teen births involve much older fathers, and that relationships between teens and older partners are more likely to lead to a teen birth than similar aged partners. And so that has led to a lot of policy attention and a lot of states in the US debating how to come up with different policies like age of consent legislation or statutory rape legislation to try to prevent these harmful relationships. when I started reading on the US literature, it struck me that there was absolutely no evidence, to the best of my knowledge, in Canada. So we don't even know if this is an issue in Canada. And that's kind of what this paper is about. And this paper, look at the 2008 age of consent increase in Canada for sexual relations from 14, as it was before, up to 16 as of 2008. The policy in Canada was not meant to explicitly target teen fertility, but was meant to crack down on adults who prey on youth. Now, conceptually, the law provided clear legal incentives against relationships that it made illegal. So relationships between teens and older adult partners. And so in that sense, it could deter harmful relationships between teens and older partners and delay childbearing of young teens, which are two things that would be a good outcome for young teens. But in practice, it's a little more complicated than that, because in practice, these laws about kind of a minimum age to do something can sometimes lead to a lot of misreporting when there's room for it. And so it wasn't clear if what the law would change is more reporting of the identity or the age of the parents as much as is kind of possible to do, and could kind of lead to secrecy or teens to kind of avoid accessing official reproductive health services. There is also some work showing that in both Canada and the US, the enforcement of age of consent laws is often pretty weak. In the sense that the bulk of cases will target sexual exploitation of children, but that it's very rare that there's a conviction involving sexual relations with a teen that is under the age of consent, but is maybe a few years under rather than much younger. And so in practice, it was kind of unclear ex ante whether we might have expected that this law would lead to a real change in behavior. The only paper that looks at this in a causal sense, so looks at the impact of age of consent laws on teen births, comes from the US, was published in 2015. And there they do find that age of consent laws tend to decrease teen births, but they only look at kind of aggregate teen births. They don't look at specifically the relationships with older partners that are explicitly made illegal by the law. And that's what I'm actually gonna focus on today. So to give you a quick overview of the results, I use a pretty standard difference in differences approach, where I'm going to use older teens that were not targeted by the age of consent increase as the comparison group. So I'm going to use teens age 14-15 as the treatment group because they were targeted by the age of consent increase. And the comparison group is going to be teens age 16 to 18. I'm going to find a decrease of about 20% in the fraction of teen births of mothers covered by the increase with substantively older partners. I'm going to be clearer about what I mean by older partner, but at this stage, you should not think of an older partner as being a teenage boy that's 16 or 17, but you should think of quite older adult male partners. Okay. Importantly, I'm going to find that this is not due to changes in reporting. Namely, the main source of reporting or misreporting, as I'm going to talk about, would come from the father's side. And I find, in fact, no impact on the likelihood that the identity or the age of fathers be reported on birth records. Okay, so it seems like a true decrease in teen births. And in fact, if you look at just all births of teens age 14-15, I'm going to document suggestive evidence of a decrease of about 3% in the total births for that age group. I'm going to complement the analysis on births with some data on abortions to show that also it seems like the law led to a net decrease in pregnancies. So the legislation in Canada was part of the Tackling Violent Crime Act. It was passed in November 2007 and became effective in May 2008. Importantly, the law had a close-in age exemption of 5 years. That means that what it kind of outlawed is relations between a teen that's age 14 and a partner that is 19 or older. And for a teen age 15 with a partner that is 20 or older. Okay, so when I define older partners or partners outside of the close-in age exemption for the rest of the talk, that's what I mean. Partners that are at least 5 years older than the teen mother in my setting. Importantly, it did not change the penalties or add new penalties, but it maintained them and extended the coverage of the penalties to now crimes that involve mothers or teens in general, age 14 and 15. In theory, these crimes could lead to a conviction that leads to a sentence of between 1 and 14 years in prison. In practice, there's no good data on how likely these crimes are kind of likely to lead to a conviction. So to try to gather information on that, I used the Canadian Legislative Online Database, CANLI, and I tried to find evidence of any conviction for a crime that became a crime specifically because of the 2008 age of consent increase. So would not have been a crime before, but was made a crime. And I found evidence of 22 convictions for the whole of Canada for 3 years of data that I looked at. So very few convictions relative to the extent to which these crimes happen, as I'm going to show you in a little. So then, but just to be clear, then that's why there's kind of a doubt as to whether this law would actually have enough bite to lead to a true change in behavior, rather than just maybe a change in reporting or actually not much happening if there was no kind of threat of punishment. Okay. So the data I use is the Canadian Vital Statistics Birds Database, which is basically the universe of birds in Canada between 2000 and 2011. Importantly, for all provinces except Ontario, I have the exact date of birth of the mother, and then I have the pregnancy length, so I can compute the age at pregnancy, which is the one that's relevant to decide if the partnership was illegal or not. And another key institutional feature is that misreporting of the mother's age or identity is highly implausible to arise in any kind of systematic large-scale way. So whenever a mother goes to the hospital to give birth, she needs to provide formal identification and register the birth. The doctor also needs to file a form. The mother needs to take both of these official forms, go to a civil office, also again register there with official identification and so on. So speaking from experts that I kind of work in hospital and kind of the maternity wards, anecdotally, they were only aware of one instance in their career where a mother kind of tried to misreport her identity. So it's unlikely to happen. But in contrast, it's perfectly legal for the father to not be reported on birth certificates. So if the mother reports throughout the process that the father is unknown or that she doesn't want to report the identity of the father, that is perfectly legal. And in fact, as I'm going to show you, it was quite frequent for births of the youngest teen mothers, right? So there's this misreporting risk that arises that I'm going to tackle as part of my empirical strategy. I'm going to complement the analysis on births using data on hospital abortions between 2007 and 2011 from the Canadian Institute for Health Information. Just a few summary statistics, because for this paper, I think the hypothesis is quite simple. So we kind of see the main results just in the summary statistics, which is always nice because then when I show you the diff and diff results, it's kind of going to be clear where it comes from. So the first two columns here are all teen mothers, so age under 20, while the two right columns are the mothers that were specifically impacted by the age of consent increase. Okay. One fact that's interesting to point out, well, it's well known in the literature that teen mothers tend to be from low-income backgrounds. And in this case, you can see that almost half of the youngest teen mothers are qualified as low income, which here means that they reside in a zip code that is in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. Okay, so disproportionate fraction in low income areas. But most related to the main hypothesis of the paper, if we look at the fourth row, that's the likelihood that a birth be from a father that is outside of the close-in age exemption, so over 5 years older than the mother. You can see, first of all, that in the pre-period, so in the period before the age of consent increase, this was actually quite frequent. It was about a fifth of all births in Canada of teen mothers age 14, 15 involved a partner at least 19, 20 or older. And importantly, it seems to have fell quite sharply in the period after the law was passed, a drop of about a third in this case. And then it's interesting when you combine that to the last row, which is the fraction of births for which the age of the father is reported. Therefore, the identity of the father is reported. And importantly, that did not fall in the period after the passing of the law. If anything, it increased a little bit, consistent with just fewer births being from older fathers that would have been more likely to kind of remain unknown on birth certificates. We look at this quickly graphically, we can kind of see a similar story. So you have the comparison group in the dashed line above, the treatment group in the full line below. You can see that after the law becomes effective, there seems to be quite a sharp drop in the fraction of births that are from fathers that are over 5 years older than the mother. While in the comparison group, we don't see that much of a sharp drop. And importantly, it doesn't seem to just drop in 2008, but it also seems to kind of keep decreasing in later years after the law was passed. But if we look at the reporting of the father's age, we don't see kind of this discrete drop when the law becomes effective. If anything, it looks like there's a broader trend between 2004 and 2010, where it just increases slightly over this period. But if we look at this a little more formally, so using a difference in differences approach, I'm going to compare mothers 14-15 who were impacted by the law to older teen mothers. So the unit of analysis is a specific birth I from a mother in age group G at time T in census division C. This indicator covered means that the mother is an age that is covered by the age of consent increase, so 14-15. Post is an indicator for the period after the age of consent increase. This is the interaction term of interest that captures the additional impact of the law for the treated group, so mothers age 14-15. And then I have some birth and parent characteristics and some time and census division fixed effects. These are the main results of the paper, essentially. The first column is the fraction of births that are with older fathers, so fathers outside of the close-in age exemption. This interaction term indicates a statistically significant decrease in the fraction of births from mothers age 14-15 that are with older fathers. Given the baseline of about 16%, this is a decrease of about 20% in the fraction of births with these older fathers. If we look at the reporting of the age of the father on the birth certificate, we find that if anything, it's a little more likely that the identity or the age of the father be reported after the law, though it's not statistically significant. And then if we just look at all births of mothers age 14-15, so not with older fathers specifically, we see suggestive evidence of a decrease of about 3%. This decrease of 3% is actually larger than what you would expect if you just scale this impact over kind of the whole population of teen mothers age 14-15, which to me is evidence that it also deterred births from older fathers, but who would have chosen to remain unknown on birth certificates even before the age of consent. Okay. Then interestingly, if we look at abortions, abortions data in Canada is a bit rough and is a bit hard to get, but that's the best that I could do in this setting. And basically, I would interpret this as no evidence that there was an uptick in abortion for teens age 14-15 after the law was passed. So if anything, it seems like it trended downwards a little bit, right? And that's important because it doesn't seem like just births were deterred because there was an increase in abortions and therefore teen pregnancy was not impacted. But it seems like abortions also fell or at least, remain roughly constant, so that there was a net kind of decrease in teen pregnancies. A bunch of robustness checks in the paper, but one additional result that I find interesting that I want to talk about is that I also test for dynamic treatment effect and to try to see if the law seems to have broken relationships between teens age 14-15 and older partners altogether. Because remember that the goal of the law was not specifically to target births. The law was to protect youth, so to deter these relationships altogether. And this paper kind of uses the extreme outcome of these relationships, which is a birth, to try to infer if that behavior changed. But it's also interesting to try to see did the law kind of do more than just preventing pregnancies and kind of seems to have deterred the relationships. And the way I get at this is by looking at the cohort of teens age 14-15 that are targeted by the age of consent increase, but then follow them as they get older. and see if their fertility fell, not only when they were 14 and 15, but also when they became 16, 17, and 18. That's what you would expect if it prevented relationships altogether with older partners, because then it's not true that if there's in a relationship with an older partner, that would necessarily have led to a birth when they're 14 or 15. It might also have led to a birth when they're 16 and 17 and so on. And that's what I find. So it seems to have deterred these relationships altogether. Although this evidence is pretty indirect, I think it's, you know, the best that can be done in this specific context. So let me quickly wrap up. The point of this paper was to provide the first empirical evidence on the impact of age of consent laws in the Canadian context. I document a substantial decrease in the fraction of births of mothers aged 14-15 with partners that were outside of the close-in age exemption. It's consistent with a net decrease in pregnancies rather than just a change in reporting or an increase in abortions. And in fact, there's suggestive evidence that it kind of deterred these relationships from happening in the first place, which was explicitly the goal of the legislation in the first place. I think it's interesting to then think back to this idea that the law seemed to have changed behavior with very little enforcement. And so it kind of fits in a body of work arguing that laws can sometimes change behavior through signaling or through changes in attitude rather than a credible threat of a high punishment. And I think this is certainly the type of crime that has a social norm element to it. So it's kind of interesting to see that by clearly making this illegal, it seemed to have changed behavior in itself, even when it was unlikely maybe to lead to a prison sentence. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to a couple of questions if you have any. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Louis-Pierre. So without putting you too much on the spot, and again, just reminding those in the audience that the Q&A box is there for you if you have questions for either Louis-Pierre or Dalibor. I guess one of the things that I maybe don't understand from your presentation is, sort of the timing of birthdays matters, right? So, I mean, is it sort of the number age that matters in terms of punishment under this law, or is it really just based on birthdays, right? Because if I can, and I noticed in one of your slides, you had like a playing around with the timing of births, right? So yeah, if I was thinking of, oh, well, if I wait a month, that age is going to be different because the way our birthdays line up. How does that work in the context of this legislation, in the context of this paper?
So what is illegal is the sexual relations. It's not the birth. The birth is evidence, right? Yeah. Exposed that there were, right? And so what was made illegal was the relation. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I'm not sure I understand the question.
So, I mean, I think the reason that this is probably not prosecuted very often is that it's probably very difficult to get, everyone on the same page in terms of, the young person would have to be willing to stand up in court and then prosecute their significant other, however society feels about that relationship. So one of the concrete things that you could think of, and I think is reflected in your analysis, is, this person is listed as the father of the child, and, that age difference, it falls afoul of this law. So I'm just wondering, in the context of someone trying to avoid, like a concrete, court admissible document, the timing month-wise kind of matters. I was just hoping you could explain that.
Well, so in some sense, it is surprising that any father outside of the closed age exemption is willing to have their identity on the birth record, because that is literally official kind of document that shows guilt. Because it is obviously possible for the criminal justice system through the hospital system to find out when the birth happened. But importantly, this is not driven, for example, by like teen mothers lying about their pregnancy date or anything, because I have this kind of robustness check there where I throw out from the analysis any young mother who was close to 16 at the time of the age of consent increase.
Okay.
And so it could have potentially misreporting the date of the birth. So let's say you can misreport up to a month, you know, when the mother became pregnant. If you throw out these, that's not what's driving the estimate. I do think it's just that these crimes are not prosecuted and convicted. But I was surprised to notice that even after the law made that illegal, some fathers reported their identity on birth certificates. That is somewhat of a puzzle. But I would say this is the first paper that even looks at the fraction in Canada of young mothers that have a much older partner. So I'm not even sure if that issue was necessarily on the radar or is still on the radar now. Yeah.
I mean, my sense would be that, you know, short of some reason to go looking for that data, it's you know, no one's going to stumble upon that and then pursue a prosecution. That wouldn't be how it works. Jiki had a question for you. Can you tell us more about the control variables from your regression?
I can try if I remember. The birth characteristics involve things like whether the birth was in a formal hospital environment or delivered by a medical professional. I wanted to check there if there could be the possibility that if I have a birth at home or something, it might be easier to misreport elements of it. It turns out that in that period, it was almost 100% of births were like in a, you know, medical formal setting. Some parent characteristics, I think, involved in this case, where the mother lives, and I think there were some demographics. I don't think there's race. When there was the country of origin, the father as well, but I'm afraid that I've forgotten some of those controls. But they don't matter actually. You know, that's probably why I kind of don't remember them, but whether the controls are included or not doesn't really change the results. Of course, low income is one of the controls. Sorry, whether the mother is from a low income background or not.
And that one does matter.
There's no interaction. There's no interaction because it's too noisy. Okay. So I looked at an interaction to see if this would have decreased more in low income areas or less. But I remember it was just a little too noisy to tell.
Okay. So we have an audience question. Could you just go over again how you know that it wasn't because fathers just weren't putting themselves on the birth certificate? Can you just show us that graph again?
Well, the graph for the diff and diff, but right here, the outcome here is whether the age of the father, therefore the identity of the father, is reported on the birth certificate. Okay, and this shows that the likelihood that the age of the father be available on birth certificates increased disproportionately for mothers age 14, 15 after the law was passed. If we thought that all that happened is that fathers remain unknown, then this would have fallen. So basically, if we would have seen a decrease here and a similar size decrease here, what that would have told us is that this decrease in births is not real. It just led to misreporting. But in fact, the different sign means that this is not a reporting change story.
So here's a question from Etienne Rousseau, and thank you, Etienne, for your question. You know, if we're thinking about this in the context of sort of rational offenders, you know, now that we've observed, I guess, a decade plus, you know, 15 years of no prosecution of these sort of crimes, do you expect this is going to continue this effect, or do you think it's transitory? And how would you test that? I'm going to add to the question.
It's interesting. I mean, for me, the fact that it kept decreasing 2008 to 2009 to 2010 to 2011 is still 3 years of no prosecution. I guess it depends on how quickly you think that you know, people will update about this. if I'm optimistic, let's say, I would like to think that this kind of changed. I mean, in some sense, it was when I talked to most people about this, they're surprised that this was even a frequent occurrence before the age of consent increase. In some sense, I don't think it was kind of positively seen by society even before 2008, but it's still, by making it explicitly illegal, I think kind of might have changed the goalpost there as to like what is seen as an acceptable behavior. In that sense, you might have expected it to decrease, because I think a rational offender, I mean, in some sense, it's hard to get data on this, even for a researcher trying to get data on this. So I'm not sure how a rational offender would kind of really learn, but a rational offender could have inferred that in 2007 or in 2009, sexual relations with a 13-year-old are very unlikely to lead to a conviction. And so it's not, right? So in that sense, it's just like, if you were looking for evidence that there's not a lot of convictions for these crimes, this was true even before the age of consent increase for younger teens. So yeah, so I don't think it's gonna kind of tick up because of no prosecution. But it will be interesting to see how this looks in later years, for sure.
Mm-hmm. I had something and then I lost it. I am going to put a quick poll into the Zoom. If anyone in the audience wouldn't mind filling it out, it just gives us a little bit of feedback to plan future sessions. Thank you, Louis-Pierre and Dalibor and Jiki for joining me as co-panelists today. And thank you especially to our presenters. We will see you next time.
Thanks very much.
And of course, yeah, the videos will go up on our YouTube channel, so they'll be accessible later if you saw something you want to find again. Have a great afternoon.